Okay, so part 2 of the Cptsd versus PTSD talk. This is really critically important. So I spent about 9 minutes talking about kind of what these conditions are, right? In other words, like talking about the problem. And and I really feel like it's important for us to remember to also like move out of that phase. And I say this a lot to the people that I work with. Okay, we like know what the issue is. We've done enough digging. We've done enough research on family history. We know why this developed. We know why this is here. We know why your parents or your grandparents were this way. We know the really dark details of what you experienced and how it's impacted your life. And that's really hard to kind of take an honest look at. And so we've spent some time in that. Okay, we know what the problem is, and now we need to consciously, in this therapeutic relationship in your life, we need to move into the healing. We need to move into the solution. And there absolutely is a solution, and there's healing, and there's another side. You can get to the other side of PTSD and CPTSD. The other thing that I want to say in just this brief part 2 talk is, with CPTSD, I would say, so it's relational trauma, and what really needs to be rebuilt, foundationally, is that relationship that we have with ourselves. And so, what often happens with CPTSD is that we learn very young that, we don't get to have ourselves. We don't get to have our lives. We don't get to pursue our interests. Like, our pursuit basically becomes at a very early age. Like, how do I need to change from who I authentically am so that I will finally be accepted and loved? And so what happens is we get cut off from our self, our capital S, our self. We get cut off from our essence. We get cut off from the who we are at our core. Maybe, and that looks, that's our personality, some of our personality traits, our quirks, our interests, our passions, our desires. We get cut off from those things at a very young age. We don't feel safe enough to explore and to figure out who we are. But this is such a fundamental part of development in early life, into teenage years, into our 20s, right? Is like figuring out who we are, what we like, what brings us passion, what brings us joy, what brings us purpose. We get cut off from that. We basically develop a life that we think is going to make somebody else happy. And it robs us. It really robs us from living authentically who we are, okay? And many of us, this is what happens, and this is what Dr. Carl Jung really talked about, is in midlife, which he kind of said was between the ages of 30 and 60. So, there's a big range there. Often many of us will kind of go through this, what he calls the dark night of the soul, which is all of a sudden we may suffer some kind of a loss, right? So we may lose a job. We may experience a really significant medical condition, cancer, heart condition. Somebody close to us may die. We may experience a rupture in a really important relationship, and it just shatters everything. And it really makes us question, who am I? Who am I? How did I get here? And do I want to live the second part of my life this way? And that's what brings a lot of folks into therapy. And there's a lot of value from being open to that process. And it's a really hard process, as anybody who's experienced it will tell you. It's really hard. It can often go on for a couple of years. But if we stay with that, shakiness, if we stay with that discomfort, we have the capacity to figure out who we are. And there's usually a lot of pain associated with that. But if we can hang in there, the second part of our life will be vastly different than the first part of our life, if that's something that we are willing to explore. And I will say this, it's usually really difficult to explore on your own. So, asking for help, I know it's so difficult for so many different reasons, but there are people who are willing to help you and be with you on that journey. And that doesn't need to be a formal therapist. That can be a body worker, that can be a yoga instructor, it can be a mentor, it can be a spiritual advisor, it can be just a trusted friend or colleague. So it's, it can look a lot of different ways. So I hope that was helpful. I just really want to make sure that we, a big part of what I'm going to be talking about is, we're talking about the problem, getting into the nitty gritties of the problem, but I really want to also stay solution focused as well, and to remind folks that there is a different way of living. There is a different way of living in this life. There's a different way of feeling and thinking and believing about yourself and about others and about the world. And so I'm here to help you in just small ways on this journey. And I appreciate you, again, listening, being willing to just learn and expand. And I hope you have a wonderful day.